Welcome to episode 3 of Agilifying Agile Coaches. This episode is called Exploring Good, the Variability of Good Practices. This is a particularly interesting area for me, but does feel a bit long and a bit dry, so feel free to drop out at any time and come back in the next episode. You still here? Okay, let's get going. In the last episode, we spoke about there being some good practices we can use within a Scrum team. These practices are normally helpful and valuable. However, as we said last time, it isn't one size fits all, so we need to be able to select and adjust these practices as appropriate to our own context. If you are a Scrum person, these would be practices in and around Scrum. If you are a full roll your own Agile person, then this could be a blank page onto which you cast the various ideas and flavours that interest you. A Kanbaner would probably fall somewhere between the two. This is where I will introduce a new set of concepts. I have been using these concepts in a very ad hoc way for about 5 years. I first formalised them for the Agile Cymru conference in 2016. I broke the concept of good practices down into 4 subgroups to help me articulate their variable nature. At the time, I defined them as tactics, patterns, pivots, and widgets. Patterns. This is not something I invented, but was first identified by Christopher Alexander and others in their book on architecture, a pattern language. The concept of a pattern is a recording and defining of positive aspects or behaviours in architecture that occur again and again. This idea was taken by Kent Beck and Grady Booch, amongst others, and introduced to the world of software as software design patterns. Agilicists such as James Copleen have taken them forward into the world of human or organisational patterns. These positive, or anti-patterns if negative, aspects reoccur across organisations and communities again and again, often periodically reinvented and rediscovered by people like us. There is a great collection of Agile, Scrum and product development patterns at the website www.scrumplop.org. Patterns include things such as sacrifice one person, whack the mole, and spirit of the game. Pivots. Pivots is the name I gave to deliberately empty or null parts of Scrum. These blank spots are not defined in detail, and so this allows us to thus vary or pivot these parts of a method. These pivots are deliberate attributes we are meant to fill with different options. So things like the filling of product backlog items, or sprint retrospective, and now even the daily Scrum. We can fill these pivot points with patterns, or anti-patterns, or widgets. The final thing is a widget. This is a bolt-on practice to Scrum, something from somewhere else that we can add on to our Scrum/Agile experience. This could be as large as test-driven design, behaviour-driven design, continuous delivery, and Kanban, or as small as Post-its. Now, these things can get a bit gimmicky if we're not careful. Things such as hourglass boards, planking during the Scrum, etc. The fourth idea I had was called tactics. I originally thought of tactics as an overall combination of patterns and widgets to achieve certain results. I don't think that much of the idea, to be honest, so I'm going to put it to one side for these episodes. But we have all seen this in our jobs with the user story plus vision plus velocity plus story points combination that many teams use in their default Scrum implementations. In reality, roll your own Agile coaches often have their own pre-packed tactics of Agile patterns and widgets that they install in every organisation they visit. Remember, roll your own, in my personal opinion, should be the team rolling their own and not the coach. Of course, these general ideas all blur together to a certain extent. Velocity is a widget, but that is derived from the organisational pattern yesterday's weather that fits into the pivot in Scrum that is sprint planning, which itself is a collection of patterns including workflows inward, etc, etc, etc. But generally, I hope you get the idea. So now we have this idea of patterns and widgets and where we can then install them into our implementations. In Scrum, these would be those pivot points. How do we decide which ones to use and how strongly should we use them? There is another factor here. Time. So I'm going to delete tactic for now, bye-bye, and add time. Time is an element not often appreciated when coaches coach. Why? Because some good practices decay with age. They become bad practices as the teams improve. And some pretty shocking practices can become viable with an advancing team. Let's look at a common widget with a very short shelf life or half-life. Team-based wideband Delphi estimation, aka planning poker. I know a few coaches who dislike planning poker, whether it's because it's slow or subjective or a bit gimmicky with the various cards and apps that are available. They are not fond of the method. But it doesn't make the method wrong. It depends on the context. I, for instance, often use planning poker with new Scrum teams to act as a stitching mechanism to get them talking and disagreeing with each other constructively, and to sort of force bind the business into that discussion. And that can work quite well. Now, it is slow, dead slow, mildly annoying, but for a new team, it gives them a bit of discipline and structure to grind out those estimates that they may feel they need. But after a few months, the ROI on the method may no longer be worthwhile. We could then swap onto some sort of affinity-based or magic estimation approach, a higher level approach with less detail but much quicker and often sufficient for a more mature team. Maybe, if the team becomes more skilled again, they may want to join the no estimates movement and start chopping their stories into similar sized lumps. That widget, that good practice, has a birth, a life, and a death, a life cycle. Some widgets have a very slow takeoff. Thinking of TDD, test-driven development specifically, this is a paradigm shift for many developers and can take months of effort to get working effectively. But once the developers start really using it and getting value, they will then be embedded forever. Story splitting is similar to TDD in that respect. It can take practitioners significant time to learn and successfully use those methods. Thus, some widgets are elephants and some are mayflies. And knowing that can be half the battle. What we do not want to do is merely work with the mayflies because it is easy or easier to introduce, because they may also die quickly. Here is another example. Tasking your engineering work in hours. Now let's look at this from the Nigel scale point of view. And by the way, if you don't know the Nigel scale, please refer back to episode 2. Now, from a Nigel scale point of view, tasking hours used to be compulsory in Scrum, NS1. Now for many people, it's NS3, an anti-pattern from the darkest hell. For me, I am still in the NS2 box. I often break my work down into time. But anecdotal time. Hey Sandra, I'll have that finished by lunchtime. Rather than,
Task 9 has 3 hours remaining. Resource 700726590 is assigned to the work.
Caveat time. I tend to only do this with new teams of limited domain knowledge and experience to help them plan. So it's sort of a bit like water wings or armbands to give them some, well, maybe faux, but some assurance to the team. Older teams, I often don't estimate the tasks, just the stories. So, tasking in hours and days. Classic Nigel Scale 1 became Nigel Scale 2, and for a lot of people is Nigel Scale 3. And this isn't just my opinion. After all, the plural of anecdote is not data. I ran a survey on Agile in 2013. I surveyed Agile experts, middle-of-the-road practitioners and newbies on the customer satisfaction of Agile via the Kano model. Since then, I have presented the results across the world. The most interesting of lots of feedback was the good practices that generated a Marmite effect. Now, if you're not from the UK, you may not know what Marmite is. Marmite is basically a yeast extract that you spread on your morning toast. Some people love it, some people hate it. So much so that Marmite actually made a marketing campaign out of the love it or hate it aspect. This resulted in the coining of the phrase the Marmite effect, or Marmite reaction, for anything which provokes strong and polarizing feelings. Some people loved those good practices and some people hated those good practices, and that was often depending on their level of experience. Can you guess which good practices got that Marmite response? Again, please reply with these ideas in the comments. If we cannot be sure exactly what good practices we should and should not install or utilize, then what do? We are going to have to run experiments/trials and be open to experimenting. To find the right balance for us, we need to inspect and adapt. That tactical default install I mentioned earlier that many do, well, that could actually be a first good step. Just make sure it is a first step and not the last. You've probably realised by now, but installation is the wrong metaphor. This is not a one-time change, but a continual improvement culture. You are, at best as a coach, planting techniques and allowing them to grow. Back to Knevin again from episode 1. I feel organisational change, and that is what introducing Scrum and Agile is, to a team is actually complex work, requiring a probe, sense, respond model rather than an out-the-box, simple mentality. I'd also suggest far better results come from this if we operate from a more collaborate stance with good practices. This is an exciting journey we are all on together, and we need to bring our enthusiasm and knowledge to this, but we don't have all the answers. Discovering the good practices together side by side is better than using this knowledge like a methodologist and imposing it on teams. Shuhari. Now, many of us have used Alistair Coburn's Shuhari martial arts metaphor. I've taken this from Martin Fowler's article on the subject. Shu is in the beginning, students follow the teachings of one master precisely. At this point, the student begins to branch out. With the basic practices working, they now start to learn the underlying principles and theory behind a technique. They also start learning from other masters and integrate that learning into their practice. Now the student isn't learning from other people, but from their own practice. They create their own approaches and adapt what they learned to their own particular circumstances. This is often used to describe the journey we are on as development teams, but it equally applies to coaches themselves. Whilst we still see very few genuine RE teams in industry, we are seeing more and more HA teams. These will need a lighter hand than a SHU team, and you would be adopting a far more collaborative or coaching stance in this scenario. Lighter touch, more Socratic questioning, less direction. Practices vary according to the team experience and knowledge. Practices will vary across time as the team ability changes, and they will also vary as the team adopt more ownership of the experience and take more ownership of the adaptations of the experience. Wow! Thus, constant team-led experimentation, inspection and adaptation of the good practices are really the only way to make this all work. This also means in large organisations and big product delivery that centralising or aligning those good practices across the Scrum teams could be a fool's errand. We would need to experiment more than ever in those scenarios. Working out the balance between alignment and differentiation in scale models is another topic for another set of episodes. However, I do believe that none of the current available models handle this sufficiently. Now, I imagine you would like to have a list of these good practices, maybe some timelines for when we can install them and or remove them. Well, I'm afraid such a list does not exist to my knowledge. But if you fancy the idea, please again feel free to capture it in the comments. Just don't be lured by the dark side of Agile coaching: methodologizing. This entire episode is probably an act of overthinking, maybe an act of navel gazing. It is almost certainly an act of methodologizing. In my mind, the issue the Agile Manifesto authors had was with methodologism. The problem with methodologism is the idea that if you think hard enough, we can fully understand and design an approach to predictably manage the world of software development. We have discovered since that no such one true way exists. There are thousands of good ways to help deliver software, and so we must adopt an approach based on empirical process control, inspect and adapt lightweight processes over fat methods. The reason I want to avoid methodologism now is the risk of methodologists, i.e., I am the expert, I have the one way to do this, Agile coach as Agile guru or thought leader. And the risk that by over-detailing this stuff, by obsessing on those beautiful details, we could capture the facts, the mechanics, but not the soul. We see the footprint, but we've missed the tiger. The footprint is not the foot. We have discussed the removal of bad practice. We have discussed the variability of good practice, how we categorize, how we can understand the life cycle of these practices, but more importantly, the need to experiment, to inspect and adapt our good practices throughout our entire time together. But what about those core practices, those fundamentals? How should we handle those? In fact, what are they? And how could they be affected, effected, infected by methodologism? Well, that'll be the next episode. Purity versus pragmatism, dissecting the core. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sticking around with this episode, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.